Today it'll be the second week of a discussion on restorative justice. This week we're going to focus more about some of the principles and some practice of restorative justice and have discussion around that. Last week we talked, as Sterling mentioned, we talked about how biblical justice, the overall narrative in the Old Testament, New Testament, is a restoring justice where we're restored in right relationship with God, with one another. And not to say that there aren't retributive justice themes in the Bible, there are. But the overall narrative is more of a restoring justice. And last week we spoke about this vision, this biblical vision of justice as shalom, where we are living in right relationship with God, with one another, and with creation. It's, as N.T. Wright mentions, he says that it's an expression of God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. It's a world set free from evil. And he says it's a new world as a beautiful healing community, to envisage it as a world vibrant with life and energy, incorruptible beyond the reach of death and decay, to hold in our mind's eye as a world reborn, set free from the slavery of corruption, free to be truly what it was made to be. This is from his book, Evil and the Justice of God. And I don't know if he even mentions this idea of shalom in this book, but this is a reflection or an illustration of that idea of shalom. But as we talked about last week, there is a wide gap or a chasm between this vision of justice, of shalom, and where we are at right now in our world. I mean, we just need to pick up our phones and scroll through our news and read about the wars in Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, Sudan, the wars in our nation as we're approaching the election season, the war of words and social media. I mean, it really is like doom scrolling when we're going through our phone and reading the news. And it's also important to realize so that we are broken people. Right? So we're living in a broken world. We are broken people. And so I can imagine that we can think of, even in our own lives, in our tension, our strain, or brokenness in our own relationships, where we've been hurt. Maybe we've hurt others. And I also think, as a church, we need to recognize and acknowledge also that as the church, we have harmed people within our congregations. People who in our community who are marginalized and maybe don't necessarily feel welcome or like they belong in the church. We've also caused harm in these situations as well. So I think it's important that we recognize that, but that is not God's vision of what he intends things to be. And I think it's also really important that as a spiritual discipline, that we take time and really try to find glimpses of shalom here and now in our world, because there is beauty. There are positive, loving relationships that we have with people, that we see and experience within our church. So it's important to focus on those, look at those, identify those. Our world is a good world. God loves all of us as people, and he loves you, he loves me as a beloved child of God. And so I think it's really important that we dwell upon that, and that really seeps into who we are and our hearts. Again, because we are broken people. Does anyone read Richard Rohr's Meditations by any chance? Did anyone read this morning's meditation? Anyway, it fits in well. His theme this week is on nonviolence and love. But he quotes Francis of Assisi. He says, before you speak of peace, you must first have it in your hearts. And I think when we dwell upon these things, when we are thinking of things that are positive, are pure, lovely, admirable, true, these ideas, when we dwell upon this, it does seep into our heart more. And when this becomes our perspective, these ideas of peace and shalom in our world now, we're able to become peacemakers in our day-to-day lives. In whatever situations that God puts us in, we're able to transform these places of hurt and brokenness, whether it's in our own lives or relationships, whether it's circumstances that God puts before us in our day-to-day lives, we're able to transform those into wholeness, well-being, and peace. And so the main idea or gist of last week's discussion from a biblical perspective is that really this idea that justice restores shalom. And Jesus, as we view his life, death, and resurrection in the Gospels, Jesus brings justice because in his interactions with people that he comes across with his disciples, he brings shalom in those spaces. We also spoke about 3 principles that anchor this idea of restorative justice, or this vision of justice. It's that justice is relational, justice heals, and justice transforms. And so we talked about images of justice that we might commonly think of. Maybe not us. I feel like in some ways I'm preaching to people that have the same heart. But in our society, these traditional ideas of justice as the courtroom, prison bars, lady justice holding scales and a sword. Even though we've talked about how that has even been misrepresented from what it was initially intended to represent. But these ideas of justice are more retributive, where ideas of restorative justice, and even images in the Bible, I talk about an image of water, and how water gives life. It heals. It's a positive, active force that can nourish, that can transform deserts into canyons. And so we spoke about that. And so how does all of this relate to our discussion on restorative justice? Well, I think the goal of restorative justice overall is we want to connect with one another as people. We want to build strong relationships. When there's harm that occurs within those relationships, as much as possible, we want to make those relationships right. So we want to restore shalom in our relationships. And there are 3 basic principles. These 3 basic principles that I spoke about last week really are core principles of restorative justice. That justice is relational, justice heals, and justice transforms. And so we're going to talk about each of those principles from a restorative justice perspective today. So first, justice is relational, and it recognizes our interconnectedness with one another. Restorative justice practitioner Kate Pranis, she acknowledges or recognizes this interconnectedness when she says that a core human need is to be in right relationship with one another. Like raindrops that are hitting water, when crime or harm occurs, the main impact is going to be on the victim, the direct victim, or the person harmed, and the person who caused the harm, right, or the offender. So that's the direct impact where it is. But again, recognizing this interconnectedness with one another, crime and its impact will ripple outwards as well. It impacts the family members of the victim, of the offender. It creates a sense of insecurity or even distrust within our communities, within the church, the neighborhood, and even in society. So restorative justice, it's dialogue-based, and it allows us to come together, all of the people that have been most impacted by the crime, to have a discussion about the crime or the harm, what happened, and how to move forward in a positive way that makes things right. So restorative justice as a dialogue, it represents inclusivity. We need to have it be inclusive, safe, voluntary, and demonstrate respect. So first, it's inclusive. We want to invite the primary people that have been impacted by a crime. There's 3 main stakeholders: the victim, or the person harmed, the offender, or the person that committed the harm. They're the 2 primary stakeholders, but then also community members, the family, others in the community that might have been impacted. Invite them into a dialogue about what happened, the crime's impact, and what each party needs especially the primary person harmed, the victim, to be able to meet their needs to make things right and move forward with their lives. As much as possible, that space needs to be physically and emotionally safe so the parties can freely and authentically share with one another. So the parties, when they come in, you have to recognize the power dynamics that might create that feeling of being unsafe. Acknowledge those power dynamics and address them before even coming into these spaces so you can have safe and authentic conversations. And along these same lines is that the process has to be voluntary. It has to be voluntary. You can't force people to participate in a restorative justice process. Or I guess you can force people, but it makes it much less restorative if you're forcing the person that caused the harm to enter into these spaces. Or if you're forcing the victim also to participate in restorative dialogue when they aren't willing to come into the space. So as much as possible, we need to have conversations about the process beforehand, and there has to be a voluntary willingness to enter into the dialogue. And from the perspective of the person that committed the harm, a baseline requirement is that they have to acknowledge what they've done and to some extent take responsibility for the harm that they've caused. Because if this isn't the case, there's a chance that the victim could be further harmed by the process. Another thing I should mention about this voluntariness really is regards to the offender participating in the process without fully taking responsibility, is ideally these processes are centered on the person harmed. And so if they want to meet with the person that hurt them, the offender, even if this person isn't necessarily taking responsibility fully or acknowledging what's happened, their desire to enter this process should drive that forward. And then finally, respect. And I think most restorative justice proponents see this as really the primary or main value of restorative justice. That when we respect others, we're recognizing their humanity, that each person is a child of God who has inherent dignity and worth, regardless of their race, their gender, sexual orientation, whether they've harmed somebody, their faith, religion, age, any of these issues. That person is a child of God, and they need to be treating them with respect in these processes. Second principle is justice heals, and it meets the needs of the people that have been impacted by crime. And again, we spoke about this last week. This idea of justice is much different than the adversarial, punitive justice that we normally think of when we think about the criminal justice process. Generally, crime occurs when someone's breaking the law, right? And so the criminal justice process, the whole purpose of it is to establish a person's guilt for past wrongs. And if we're thinking about the scales of justice, when a person is found guilty of harming another person, justice requires that person to suffer an equivalent harm to balance those scales of justice. And so oftentimes justice will require punishment. Often the court imposes that punishment as incarceration, where there's a physical separation from society. But even if it's not necessarily incarceration, it's an idea that the person can also be socially excluded as well through the stigma or shame that might attach to the harm that the person has caused. And generally, when we think about criminal justice, three questions drive the process, where really it's focused on the offender as a lawbreaker. What law was broken, who broke the law, and what do they deserve? Really, the person that's been harmed and even the community have much less involvement within the criminal justice process. On the other hand, restorative justice, it asks a different set of questions that's more focused on what are the needs of primarily the victim, what do they need to heal and to move forward with their lives. It also allows us to look at the needs of the community. It allows us to look at the needs of the person that committed the harm. And so the question is the questions that we ask are, who has been harmed? What are their needs? And who has a responsibility to meet those needs. And so like I mentioned, there are three main stakeholders that we want to look at what their needs are from the justice process. Again, because restorative justice is about how do we restore the situation. And we talked about last week, how can we transform the situation to make things right. And the focus is really on meeting the needs of people, both of the three main stakeholders, the victim, the offender, and then the community. And they each have different needs. The victim has a need for healing. The offender or person who committed the harm has a need for accountability. And the community has a need for safety and well-being. So let's look at each of these. First, the victim or the person harmed has a primary need for healing. Obviously, each person that's been harmed, they're going to have different needs that come up. But I think there are common needs that we'll see within cases, regardless of the type of victimization that might have occurred. First, crime in its essence, it disempowers people. It makes people feel like they have lost control. And so justice, or a real need, a justice need, is for a person to regain control of their lives. So oftentimes, a victim or a family member, they may need space to be able to talk about what happened, to be able to ask questions to the person that had harmed them about why they did something. Even this idea where if a person comes in and acknowledges what they've done, it gives them a sense of regaining control in their lives. And kind of related to that as well as the second need is a vindication. That a person, us, or victim, often doubts themselves, they blame themselves for what happened, and so what they need is a strong statement that what happened to them is not right. So this could be done in the courts. That's what a conviction does, right? It's a public vindication of the person, ideally. But even more powerful is when that person that has committed the harm takes responsibility and acknowledges it within that space. There's a vindication there. And even that, a sense of apology can help that as well. Third, and this is probably the most urgent need, is the victim or the person harmed will have a need for safety, right? Physical safety, emotional safety, both for themselves as well as other people that could be potentially harmed by a person. Also, crime and wrongdoing, their impact, it actually causes a person trauma, emotional harm, physical harm. And so very real needs for a person will be restitution or some kind of monetary compensation to help meet these needs. But often an apology, a sincere apology, this discussion that might happen in a dialogue could help meet some of these emotional needs. In relational cultures, a lot of times an apology and symbolic restitution is enough. But really what happens, or what's the power of restorative justice processes, is it lets the victim say, these are what my needs are, and this is how you can meet them. And so I want to pause there, and I want to show a video that illustrates this that we can watch. It involves a case of a young man who stole a car from a woman, and it went to a restorative justice diversion process, so it didn't go into the criminal justice system necessarily as far as a trial, but it went to a diversion process that was more restorative. And this woman, her name is Sujata Balika. We'll watch. She facilitates restorative justice processes.
A stolen car. And we reached out to the young person, and he pretty quickly took responsibility for it, and was very open to meeting with his victim and making it right, and explained that he was really poor, but he was willing to get a job and try to figure out, how to do that with the victim. So we reached out to the victim, and the victim was extremely unhappy that the case had been diverted. She actually knew a little bit about diversion because she worked for a law enforcement type entity, and was adamant that she had been out of pocket $4,000 in costs because of this car, and wanted to see $4,000. And so in meeting with the young person and his family, his mother's documented work, jobs, they were living in the most, in the kinds of poverty that we just shouldn't have in the United States, with so many other people's children living with them just to have a place to eat. And I knew that this mother and this young man were not coming up with $4,000. And so the person I was training at the time asked me, so are we gonna send the case back? Because there's no way this woman's getting what she wants. So I go back to her and I say, would you have any interest in doing this even if $4,000 might not be the outcome? Is there some other reason to do this? And she brought a friend with her that day, and he said, I would really love for you to move forward. And she said, yeah, I just want to meet with this kid and tell him that what he did wasn't okay. And her friend said, I really would like to meet with this young man too. So on the day of the conference, it was very powerful. Her supporter, the person who had come with her, at one point, as the youth who'd stolen the car, couldn't remember what color the car was, and it became evident that he'd stolen many cars, and the victim's getting angrier and angrier, and you're never gonna learn your lesson. And at this point, her friend leans in and he says, I know you. And my heart stopped because I was like, oh, we usually research these things better, and I had no idea there was a pre-existing relationship between these two parties. And he says, I know you because I used to be you. And he proceeds to tell the most powerful story about how he himself got caught up in stealing cars, and it derailed his life, and how he got his life back on track. And it was like as if the rest of the room disappeared, and this young man and this man who turned his life around engaged in a dialogue about how does one turn one's life around. And he says, you know, you have to stop hanging out with your homies in the way that you used to. But don't come out of your life, don't come out of your heart. Just don't include them in every aspect of your life. So you show up for the baptism, but you don't stick for the after, right? And you always say, I gotta get to work, and they respect that. So what makes you happy? What do you believe in, you know, about yourself? Or what are you good at? And the kid pops up and he says, you know, I'm a really good artist. And his mother starts laughing. And she says, you can't pay this woman back $4,000 with your art. And just then the victim jumps in and she says, oh, yes, he can. Yes, he can, actually. She was so moved by this dialogue, right? And she says, if he paints me at Tinkerbell as tall as I am, she's about 5 feet tall, as tall as I am, I'll forgive all the debt. And we're looking to like, Tinkerbell? So did she say Tinkerbell? So I started taking notes, and she's describing the exact Tinkerbell and what color the Tinkerbell needed to be, and it had to be an old school one without too much cleavage, so she was very particular about the Tinkerbell. And the kid is really excited, but he's also like, I don't know how I would canvas and did it when she's describing. I'm like, well, find you a community, an artist, person who will help you with this. And so I was thinking of my friend Evan, who I knew would definitely be interested in doing this. And so ultimately, the young man does paint this. Just within a few weeks, he got a job, raised enough money for all the art supplies he wanted to do himself, painted the most amazing rendition of Tinkerbell on canvas, and the victim asked him to bring it to her home and help him install it, you know? And then he ended up getting involved with other community art projects and actually getting involved in the program at Community Works, where he had been involved in this case, you know, and just helping out other kids who got in trouble. So his life turned around completely, and he stayed out of trouble consistently after that. And the Tinkerbell is really beautiful. But I think what's really, when people ask what do victims want, you know, it's different in every case. And I always think you never know, it might be Tinkerbell. Like, you have no idea what is going to leave a crime victim satisfied. So some people might say, oh, that's soft on crime, he stole a car and he gets to paint something. But if that's what the victim wanted, and that's what keeps him out of trouble for the rest of his life, then we should be really happy about Tinkerbell.
There's the Tinkerbell. So what was everyone's thought? How does that resonate with you as far as a justice process concerned? What comes up in your mind? Not all in that way, that's right, that's true.
Love.
Love, yeah.
Sounded like it was fair, you know, it just sounded like it was kind of fair, you know. I mean, she wanted 4,000, but she was also willing to submit to a Tinkerbell, you know.
Yeah, and it makes it much more likely, a court could have imposed $4,000 in restitution, but the reality of this actually being paid was not the case. And we've even seen that in these kinds of restorative processes where the person that's committed the harm, they are involved with the process. They're much more likely to follow through with the commitments, whether it's a payment plan or whether it's painting a Tinkerbell, which we get done in a few weeks. So it's much more likely because of that ownership there. And just along, you're right, these processes, they're not perfect. It's not panacea for things. But at the same time, we're not comparing it to a perfect criminal justice system. We're actually looking for ways that we can meet the needs of the people that have been harmed primarily. And so restorative justice gives us that space. But they don't always end perfectly, and at times even the victim might even be hurt through the process, or the person that's committed the harm, maybe they won't follow through with what they commit. And so it's not perfect, but we're not comparing it with a perfect alternative either. And it's also, I should say too, it's another option, or it's an alternative. So we're not looking at restorative justice necessarily right now anyway to replace a criminal justice system, which Sterling had asked about last week, but it's really to complement the criminal justice system and to make the process more restorative for the people that have been harmed.
Thanks for the question. So in this case, did the victim have a choice, or was she just kind of?
She had a choice, yes. In this case, it was a diversion case. So it could happen, and I'm not sure how this program is set up, but generally it could happen two ways. If the person that's committed the harm is taking responsibility, then they'll have the option of participating in a diversion process from the criminal justice system into a conference, restorative conference. Ideally, you want the person that's been harmed to participate. It's most powerful that way. If not, an alternative is to have a surrogate victim, what they call a surrogate victim, to also participate, who may not, it's not the same victim, but they have a similar experience, or they can speak from that perspective, who participates. So that's another alternative. Where it's not as fully restorative because you're not bringing the two parties together, but it is restorative still.
I was just very moved, and I mean, for one thing, I think that committing a harm can cause somebody to feel very burdened by a sense of shame or isolation or the narrative that they're not a good person. And so for the victim supporter to say, like, I see you, I friend you, I think was very powerful, and just how the process resulted. It wasn't, the end result wasn't just about and like breaking even. He then was involved in the community and like helping other people to find that sense of purpose that's going to allow him to, you know, have something else for his identity and not commit those harms again.
Yeah, thanks.
Also, I think the present was key in this case to show both the victim and the offender. There is helpful, like, evidence that this person's life can change and be turned around. That what the say, you know, is operation.
Yeah, and that's how the community was involved with the process, where this person who was a support person for the victim was able to speak into that situation. Evan, who was also a community member, was able to come along and help him do the Tinkerbell much larger. But going back to your point as well, so when I was in India, we worked primarily on cases of sexual harm, and even within families. And one of the things that I brought it up on one of the needs, I didn't mention it specifically, is that need to be supported. There's so much shame around those issues, and the need to be supported and believed by the people closest to you, because a lot of times that's what had happened, is that the person that had been harmed wasn't believed. They weren't supported by their family. And so when you're able to have that support in an environment that's more restorative, it becomes a powerful way to help a person heal. And also the person is they're also able to have that vindication, the questions answered, and really the focus being on their needs and what they need to, not to heal. You're not gonna ever be able to heal always from things, but to be able to move forward and deal with the trauma, some of that healed trauma.
So, to underscore this point, I mean, it might have not been able to go forward without the support person, the victim. And it just strikes me as that's very much like Alcohol Anonymous, because somebody's been there and be a support person and get them through and take off.
Yeah, Alcoholics Anonymous, if you look at the 12 steps, it really takes you through what we're talking about this morning as far as a really restorative healing process. So you're exactly right. And we'll even talk in a little bit about the importance of community to helping people who've been harmed, as well as people who've committed harm, both to reintegrate back into the community and the importance of that.
Well, and then just the evidence of, the sense of community. I mean, she happens to know evidence of that. And otherwise, you think that when you think they're all on its own. So, better than community, it wasn't just that.
Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts, Sterling?
Yeah, I understand this this concept focuses a lot on what the victim needs and empowering the victim. But I'm wondering, what about society's need to deter future criminal conduct? So, for example, if someone can steal multiple cars and they get caught this time and they just have to draw a picture of Tinkerbell, the cynical part of me kind of thinks, well, that probably doesn't deter them from reoffending and even from other people maybe doing similar crimes. So I wonder about society's need to kind of prevent future harm and protect the public.
So go ahead.
Yeah, as you were saying before, the operating system that is the other side. So a person can serve jail time and still go out and do more harm. I mean, this was a wonderful situation. In fact, I think the perpetrator got a little lot more because he had to change his life, which was a good thing, but he didn't know it. And that's real.
Yeah.
It almost seems natural that this kid got what he actually needed, because I kind of imagine if he really liked art, he probably had heard it multiple times and can't really on it, And this gave him the opportunity to have it valued and showed him what he could do with it. And put him in a position, since he did go on to do other projects and work with community things, where he could also talk to young kids and maybe be, yeah, we don't know.
We don't know.
Yeah. But I can see all kinds of things. And he'll find out, yes, it can be hard to make the truth hard, but people do it,
Yeah, and I would want to say too, though, that when we are looking, especially at crimes like murder, sexual harm, there is the severity or the seriousness of those crimes. It impacts society. And so from a societal perspective, one of the things about law is that ideally the laws are going to be reflecting the values of the society. So there should be a voice in that process. So Sujata, she wrote an article where she did a restorative process in a murder case that happened at the plea bargaining stage. And so it was a restorative dialogue. The person still was part of the criminal justice process, but the people had a voice. The person that committed the murder was still put to prison, but it was more restorative. And so all that to say is that that is a real thing. But looking at ways, how can we make the process more restorative? How can we include the people that have been most harmed, especially community members, especially the victim, figure out or at least hear what their needs are and help to meet those needs. Recognizing also that society will have needs as well, community members will have needs.
I wanted to say that I remember Richard Nixon running for election in 1968 on Law and Order. it seems to me from that point, the attitudes of society have caused so much towards crime and criminality. And, we've all changed because of this constant, negativity from politicians and, arousing our fears and our resentments. And so a program like this, balances things out and begins to helps us to see that it's a lot more complex than politicians want to make it.
And even those questions, and I'll move on, and we can have more conversation on that later. But I think even those questions where it's compared retributive justice and restorative justice, it's not binary like that. It's really, we're looking at ways, how can we respond to this more restoratively in a system where really the criminal justice system is our main way to deal with crime anyway. We can also look at our systems within schools or within our communities or even our church. But from a criminal justice perspective, this is what we have, and how can we make these processes more restorative incrementally? And maybe over time, we'll have a restorative system. Like I mentioned last week, New Zealand has their primary system within youth justice is a restorative justice system. But let's go ahead and we'll move on. And just talk about the second set of needs for the person that's committed the harm, or the offenders, that need for accountability. Who thought that this Tinkerbell story, there was accountability in that process? And why do you say that?
Why do I say? They made the person think a little bit. I don't know, depending on what the crime was. I don't know what the crime was, but I just want to know what's the significance of a Tinkerbell. What's behind that? Is there something behind that? You know the story about it or anything?
Oh, the Tinkerbell?
Yeah.
It was, I'm not sure why she wanted him to paint a Tinkerbell, but that was what was important to her. So, but I'm not sure why.
Okay.
But does anyone else? Why is that?
I think one part of the accountability is just having to sit in a room face to face with the person that has been harmed and to hear how it impacted them. And I think if it was just punishment focused, like here's your, sentencing, then they might not have to really face what they did and the impact and this process they did.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly right. When we think about accountability, like justice, we think of punishment as accountability, but really that's more of a passive accountability that the court imposes, and the person never has to face up to what they've done. So the beauty about restorative justice is that happens. Like, what's your name? Francesca. So like Francesca was saying, it requires the person to come in, face the person that they've harmed, and take responsibility for what they've done to that person. And there's a shift that's more likely to happen within those situations. And then that person needs to take proactive steps to meet the need, whatever those needs are that person, the victim, has expressed, and take those active steps to make things right. So that's more of an active accountability where the person is being held accountable.
Yeah, in this case, he said also that he got a job to earn the money for the supplies, and he made a painting, and I think as an artist, what a person makes is like their baby. And then he gave away his baby too.
Yeah.
Presumably that he liked to her.
But so when people say, it's soft on crime or there's no accountability, that's not necessarily correct. Maybe from a criminal justice sense, as far as punishment or imprisonment. But there is accountability. It could make more impact, or I would say, it does make more impact than sitting in a jail cell. Really quick, when we're talking about accountability or that need to be held accountable, it's really that idea is that the person has to take responsibility for what they've done. They have to acknowledge it. There has to be an acknowledgement of what they've done. But then also to some extent, they need to have a sense of acknowledgement or even remorse for what they've done. And so this goes to that idea of there needs to be an inner transformation. The person needs to communicate that sense of remorse. A lot of times this is done through an apology, where there's not a shifting of blame or a minimizing of what had happened, but a true apology for what has happened without conditions. and then the active steps to repair the harm. And ultimately, really what a person wants that's been a victim, they want that victimization to stop. They don't want that person to commit harm to another person. And so they want that changed behavior. So that's a part of the process as well. And then finally, the community has a need for safety and well-being. And really in large parts, the community, like we saw in the process, they play a supportive role. So they may enter into a restorative justice process, and they may be able to express their needs. It depends on the process, right? But really their role is more of a supportive role with the people that have been harmed, but also with people who have committed harm even. And so we saw in the Tinkerbell example that man came in, he really offered a voice that was important to the process. And so when we talk about different kind of community groups, obviously the family is going to be an important community group that's involved in the process. But there could also be support groups, like what we talked about with Alcoholics Anonymous, or other support groups, businesses, and churches. And the idea here, it goes beyond just that restorative dialogue itself. The community could be involved with it, but really it's like, well, okay, what happens after that conference, right? And so the victim or the person harmed, they will need the support of the community. The person that's caused the harm, they might go into prison, right? And so how can we reach out to these people who are excluded from society? How can we reach out and maintain the connection with people who are in prison? And then when they go back home to their communities, how is we as a community, especially church communities, right? How can we, instead of having that stigma continue, whether it's the victim or a formerly incarcerated person, how can we reach out and build connections with those people and be able to walk with them, like we spoke about, to help make it more likely that they will become a part of a community where there's safety and well-being. And with that, I do want to play one more video, just really quick. What I love about this video is it's from a group called Underground Ministries, and they, as a church, they will adopt one person who's coming out of a prison. They'll form a group that will support that person as they're reintegrating back into the community and help to meet their needs as they reenter the community. And so let me go ahead and play that video really quick. It's a short video. I'll play the short one.
Our One Parish, One Prisoner program guides your OPOP team, 5 to 7 members of your congregation, through a 1 to 2 year journey of relationship, through prison letters, calls, visits, the whole time building trust, building friendships, and building a release plan together, where your team can accompany your releasing friend through their early months of reentry into the community together. All this follows our 24 monthly learning modules that covers everything from how do you write your first letter, how do you build trust, how do we share a mutual process of storytelling, opening conversations about realities like mental health and addiction that affect us all, even introducing some contemplative prayer exercises. Our modules also will walk your team through things that are maybe more foreign, such as legal financial debt and many of the barriers to reentry facing so many returning citizens. Your team can learn about this together, and we even walk you through how to involve your wider congregation for a deeper process of education, discipleship, and mobilization.
And so this is just a very practical way, this kind of program is a very practical way that the church can just meet people who are returning from prison and walk with them back into the community, rather than what we too often do is continue to judge them, stigmatize them, and exclude them, which really makes them, when we're talking about especially high risk, high need people, what they need is support and people around them. And what ends up happening is if they're excluded, they're more likely to fall back into crime. So I love that program and that idea. Finally, the third principle is justice transforms. And the idea is, we talked about it last week, is restorative justice is almost a misnomer. That really what we're doing is we're transforming this brokenness, this hurt into something different, into more beautiful, something more beautiful like this Japanese art form of kintsugi. And so when we talk about restorative justice, a lot of times what will come from it is it will create empathy, on both sides. Both the person that's caused the harm will have more empathy towards the person that they harmed, and vice versa. The victim or the person harmed will have more empathy for the person that's harmed them. And so it's more likely to lead to things like forgiveness, reconciliation, remorse, redemption within the community. And so there's a much more likelihood of transformation. But what I do want to emphasize is restorative justice isn't about that necessarily, right? It's about creating those conditions that will make this more likely. But you can't force forgiveness. You can't force remorse or reconciliation. But again, what you can do is try to create those conditions where it's more likely to happen, where there's opportunities for dialogue, meeting the people that are bringing people together that are most impacted by a crime, having the community as a supportive element that's more involved, much more likely anyway than a criminal justice process where that's not the case. The other thing I want to mention too, and I don't think I got to it as well, is that what's powerful about restorative justice is that it allows us also to look at root issues that might have contributed or led to the harm. And so with the case of individuals that commit harm, it allows you to look a little bit more deeply, well, what was involved there? Unhealed trauma that person might have experienced when they were a kid. Maybe issues with addiction, anger. Some of those things that might have contributed to the harm, you're allowed to bring those up or address those. Because that's going to be a real need for the person that's been harmed. It's like they need to take care of what's going on with them. That's kind of a huge thing to change their life around. But it also allows you to look at systemic issues, unjust structures, explore those as well. Maybe not within necessarily a conference between the victim and offender, but maybe community circles where it allows you to discuss some of those issues more deeply. And so again, the idea here is that when we have restorative justice, it sends off these positive ripples, right? It's much more positive into the community to counteract the negative ripples of crime. So it does offer a counteract to that. And I focus mostly on the criminal justice system, but this is really a framework of addressing harm and of living with one another. And so you can have similar discussions about ideas of restorative justice in schools. And the schools within San Diego County are implementing restorative justice processes to address discipline issues and more, just to create a restorative culture where people feel like they belong more within the school systems, but in communities, churches, workplaces, and even nations. And so a couple of years ago, I went to Rwanda. And are people familiar with the 1994 genocide that happened? So within 3 months, in April to June of 1994, 800,000 people, Tutsis and moderate Hutus within the country were murdered. Sometimes neighbors were murdering neighbors in churches, of all places. And so I went back there to see some of the restorative justice projects that were being implemented there. They implemented a project called the Reconciliation Villages, where they really brought people together, people who had perpetrated the harms and survivors or family members of victims from the genocide, brought them together where they lived into the same village. They worked together, their kids played together. And through this way, over time, is they were really trying to establish connection in a very real way. In fact, I was talking with the person that was leading this, and he was saying, you're talking about restorative justice, but this is restorative justice. And obviously doing it in a way where it's not causing further harm, so being also very mindful of the trauma that's involved in also addressing some of those issues. But also recognizing that, people who've caused harm and people who have harm, we are going to live together, and we need to figure this out if we're going to move forward as a country. And then just very, very practically, yeah, this is my daughter, Dia. And so, like I said, we can live out these values in our lives. And not to treat like my wife's nice one, but I will. So we, over Labor Day, we went to Old Town to spend Labor Day there. There's this place where they make pottery there, and you might see like some Talavera pottery. They have like pendants and things like that in the store. And so we were looking around there because we had lunch there that day, and we left. And so a couple of nights later, we're putting Dia to bed, and she says, she had to confess something. She's like, Mommy, Daddy, I have to tell you something. I took something from that store. Like, you took something from the store? What? So she'd like, show us, what did you take? And so she stood up on her bed and she had pinned, so there's this banner that hangs on her wall. She had pinned this little cross on her wall with a push pin. And so she had taken this cross and pinned it. And so it's like touched our hearts because it's like, okay, it's a cross. We stole a cross. But so we said, but Dia, we have to take care of that. And so last Sunday, after we shared last week, we went back to that place, that store, and we talked with the owner. And before we went in, Dia was practicing. She's like, okay, I stole the cross. I stole this cross. I'm sorry for what I did. I know what I did was wrong. And so she went in and met the owner, and I think the process really tight, and she was scared. Like throughout the week, she kept bringing up, will he be mad? Will the owner be mad at me? And so when she met the owner, he said, you mean you forgot to pay for the cross? He's like, you forgot to pay for the cross. And he said, what's your name? And he asked Dia her name. She said, Dia. He's like, Dia, I think God wanted you to have that cross. And so the whole process, and then we continue to look around the store, and he's like, Dia. And there's this man that was making pottery there, like little small pots. And so he said, Dia, I want you to make your own pot here right now. And so it was just a beautiful process, restorative. And it's not going to necessarily walk through all those steps, but I feel it makes more of an impact than us saying, oh, you can't watch TV for a week, right? So, and it also obviously made an impact on the person, the owner as well. But thank you very much for letting me share with you. And yeah, it's been great to spend the last couple of weeks with you. Are there other questions? Or do we have time? Maybe just a couple of minutes?
Just an observation. You showed us sort of a pie chart. And I'm thinking that those pieces overlap. They need to overlap because when the community allows for these processes, the community benefits, as well as the individuals, because when we forgive, we go through a process that sort of cleanses us as well. So everyone benefits and those connections are.
Yeah, and in reality, it's more like a Venn chart, Venn diagram, where you have, there's a lot of overlap there, yeah.
Well, this struck by me, these stories are wonderful, power of healing stories. I think that's very therapeutic.
Thank you. I wanted to bring in the stories of hope too.
And what strikes me about it gives people dignity. With our discouraging question of Biden's plan to give people a job that doesn't give any opposed to the former president, didn't pay people for their jobs. And so, I mean, the interaction with your daughter, that gave her dignity. And I do remember hearing the story that you talked about shame part, and that, I can remember in one culture, hearing about one culture, that it has an extramural affair that people put on these more chants and go and shame them. And this seems much more.
Yeah, and there is an idea of a reintegrative shaming, where you're recognizing the harm that's been done, but not lessening the dignity of the person or that person's value as a human. Thanks. Other thoughts? Any final thoughts?
I just wanted to speak to Sterling's question a little bit more about, how is this process going to deter people? And if you look at our punitive system, we'd be the safest country if punishment was enough deterrence, because, we do have a really harsh punitive system. And so I think it's still necessary to have those defined fines, sentences, this is the punishment for this crime. However, I think there's a big social justice piece as well. And, there was some mention in this talk about, what are the overall circumstances that perpetuate crime, such as poverty, shame, isolation. And a lot of times these punitive systems are perpetuating the very things that cause crime in the first place. And so, even though deterrence might still be necessary, it's more about looking at the entire system and the entire set of circumstances that are causing this and, moving forward in a different way. And I have heard some critiques of restorative justice in that it's, helping these situations within this system that still continues to harm. And so there's still just a lot more work to be done in overall equity.
And there's even ideas of the prison, we talked about the prison system, leaves the person worse off than when they went in because of the culture of the system. And arguably we can't do anything about the prison system. It's just the very nature is it's going to be coercive, punitive. But there are restorative prison models that are focused more on the healing of the person, the relationships, keeping them connected with society, those kinds of things. Restorative open prisons in Norway. There's a prison system in Brazil that's more of an open prison that invites the community member that's actually within the community, invites people within the community to be involved. So again, I think that's arguable. Can you have a restorative prison? I don't know, but a good point. Thank you.
What if we're evolving towards a more humane general attitude in society rather than a shame-based system? Years ago, I heard a psychologist describing the difference between shame-based system and one that's based on specific facts and evidence. And he said, let's say you have a child who spills milk at dinner time. And the shame-based system would be, oh, you're always spilling your milk. You're a fumble, or you're just hopeless. And there's no way for that child to make reparation for the fact that the milk is spilled. But in a system that is based on what happened, really, you could say, oh, you spilled your milk. Well, you're going to have to get a cloth and clean it, and no more milk for supper tonight, and that's it. Rather than shaming the person, allow the person to make reparation and to go on from there.
Thanks, Carol. So 2 more comments.
Well, as Carol has taught us from Luther, I hate the sin, but love the sinner. But it strikes me that to get to justice is a prerequisite for peace, but getting to justice isn't always a peaceful process. I mean, I'm just trying to think, what are we going to do in Gaza if we can ever get this, war resolved? So I think you have to go through some pretty tough periods to get to justice.
Yeah, I think especially when you're trying to get peace through violence. Anyway.
I once read about a culture, and I don't remember any of the details, like the name or where, but when someone committed a crime or a wrongdoing, the village would surround the person and remind them of everything good that they had done to kind of pull them back into the community.
And I think there's a balance there too, is that you also have to be mindful of the person that's been harmed and their real needs. And so, so just bringing that person who's committed harm back into the community, but also recognizing what is the impact that that's having on the person that's been harmed, and making sure that their needs are acknowledged as well. And I do want to kind of get to your point. I feel like, so with justice, we talked about how first there's an intervention, right, that might be required. We need to stop the injustice that's going on, and then there's a response. So a lot of times restorative justice is really focused on what's happened after the intervention has occurred. There's also the ideas of like, okay, well, first, is there ways that we can build up community and de-escalate tension or conflict before harm actually occurs? But then what's been inspiring to me, living and working in India, was Gandhi, and his intervention was a nonviolent intervention. We spoke about nonviolence in the book Study at Lent as well. And so again, we have to be careful with that, right? As far as how we're responding to violence, is nonviolence the best way to do that? But I think that's another paradigm shift as far as how, instead of us instinctively thinking that we've got to stop violence with violence, there might be nonviolent alternatives that we can look at. So, and we've seen that here with Martin Luther King Jr. in the US as well, in the civil rights movement. Okay.
The only thing I wanted to say is, we've got repeat offenders. Because last time it was on the jury, it was a repeated offender, and he had no remorse for the victim. And I swear, when we got back to the jury, everybody had the same opinion that I did. And he showed no remorse. So how, as a jury member, do you show remorse?
And again, I think so restorative justice, it could be however many times a person has caused harm. The idea is like, hey, this is a better way to address things than prison. But with that said, is that a fundamental requirement or condition is that the person who's committed harm needs to have a sense of responsibility, acknowledge what's happened, and not only what's happened, but what I did was wrong. So there is that. You can never measure a person's extent of remorse, but I think what you can arguably say is that person will gain more empathy and is more likely to be changed through an interaction where they have to look a person in the eye and say, yeah, what I did was wrong, and hear about the impact that it had on them. That's much more likely to change that person than a criminal justice process where they're maybe put in prison for a short time, but they most likely will rejoin the community. Again, it's not perfect, but that's the thought process. Okay, well, thanks everyone. It's good to be with you, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that I can answer. Thanks.